In this edition of BRG's Nurse Executive Podcast, I speak with Karen Barrow, a registered nurse by background, ACHE Fellow, and Associate Director in BRG's Clinical Variation Team. We discuss key aspects of reducing clinical variation and how this focus can improve quality and reduce cost. So let's get started.
Welcome to the BRG Nurse Executive Podcast. BRG is a global consulting firm that helps organizations in disputes and investigations, corporate finance, and performance improvement and advisory. BRG's healthcare performance improvement practice offers multidisciplinary services to healthcare organizations. We focus on implementation with innovative, independent, and data-driven solutions. In the BRG Nurse Executive Podcast, we discuss improving patient care by advancing nursing leadership. For more information about BRG, please visit thinkbrg.com. Now here's your host, Nick Chmielewski.
Karen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for the invitation, Nick.
So when we talk about clinical variation, what exactly is it? What are we looking at, and why is it important to nurse leaders and to healthcare executives?
It's about the need to eliminate unwarranted clinical variation. It's critical not only for ensuring patient safety and quality, but it's also a key component in reducing our overall cost of healthcare, not just within our own hospitals, but nationally.
Okay. What are some key things that we should look at in terms of variation?
I think you first have to understand what variation is. It can be anything from the overuse, the underuse, or even a different use and waste of healthcare services or products that provide varying outcomes. And I think the next point is we have an industry that is rapidly shifting from volume to value-based reimbursement. And understanding that variation in what is unwarranted will be important in guiding the value-based healthcare for our hospitals.
What are some positive effects of successful reductions in variation?
It actually leads to higher physician engagement. It also optimizes your staffing at a time when we're having difficulty finding some of our labor. It reduces length of stay and significantly improves your throughput. In addition, it can help reduce your ED boarding. And then the next two, of course, is reduce cost. And most importantly, clinical variation reduction improves patient safety and care.
Can you talk a little bit more about the connection between clinical variation and an organization's performance, both financially, but also in terms of quality and patient satisfaction?
Sure. So if you have wide variation, you're going to have less predictability in your finances, which leads to lower operating performance. As hospitals focus on eliminating waste and duplicative services, standardized clinical pathways will help reduce overall utilization of things like tests and labs. On the other hand, with high clinical variation and what I refer to as erratic utilization, it's much more difficult to accurately predict your cost. So understanding and addressing sources of variation lets your executives and your clinicians focus on what is unique to the patient and their current situation. And it lets your organization focus on delivering the best possible care for its patients.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about that. What are some things about clinical variation that you look at when you go into an organization and you're working with a client? What are some key areas that are either a high quality value proposition or a high cost reduction opportunity?
I would look at everything from length of stay to CDI to productivity and throughput, and even go down into some product usage and test usage. So it's pretty much everything when it comes to throughput of the patient.
Do some surgeons use more expensive equipment than others? Is that part of this?
It needs to be part of it, Nick. And it's not just the products that they're using, it's are they using off-label products with little evidence of improved outcomes? So it's definitely a big piece of it. And we do see significant variation in use of products in the high implant areas, such as spine, orthopedics, cath lab. And of course, now we're into TAVRs and a lot of progressive cardiology procedures. The challenge, Nick, is about getting credible data that physicians as scientists will engage in and will allow themselves to be compared to their peers for the best outcomes and the best cost. So what we have to do is get credible data, and that is very difficult for most hospitals. That means getting into your OR records and tying them to the materials management system, and then tying them to your outcome data. It's a difficult task.
So once we get the data, and this is a challenge, again, that a lot of hospitals have, that you and your team are able to work on, is getting the data and finding out cost per product use or cost per patient case, cost per procedure, and stratify that by physicians. And you put that in front of the physicians. What typically is their response?
So most of the time it's surprise, because most of these physicians are not aware of the true cost. The information they're getting on cost for procedures, in particular in the non-for-profit healthcare systems, their information is coming from a sales rep. And we have to go in armed with data from materials management, from the hospital records. It's just a plethora of data, so that I always refer to it as being bulletproof. That might not be an appropriate term for a lot of hospitals, but you've got to have all the information. And once they have that information, it's a peer-to-peer competition. No one wants to be on that high end of the curve. So they usually 99% of the time respond well.
So getting the data is the challenge, and the response, once you've got great, accurate data, is that it's going to yield hopefully a change in behavior. It
does. And when we're with the physicians, we don't want to exclude things like length of stay and a comparison to GMO, GMLOS. In particular, in high-cost procedures like spine, you also need to be aware of how long the patient is in the hospital.
So it's a total view, not necessarily looking at one particular tool. It's how does that tool impact the overall cost?
Because if you don't do that, the physicians will say, yeah, this may be more expensive to implant, but my patients are leaving a day early. So we want to make sure we have a comprehensive overview. And we even look at readmissions, Nick, to determine if there are significant readmissions with any particular physician or procedure.
Okay. What's one thing that you know about clinical variation now that you wish you knew earlier in your career?
Probably the thing I learned the most about is effectively partnering with physicians is always key. Early on, my hospital administrators were inclined to turn it over to the department chairs or to a high volume physician. These factors didn't mean that a provider would be a successful leader. And boy, did I find that out, in particular with a couple surgery procedures that we were working on. I learned that system-wide physician engagement requires identifying or naming a physician champion that would serve as a leader. And I found out that a strong physician champion is clinically active. They're not just an academic or an executive, and someone who's highly respected by their peers. And it's important to find someone who really is enthusiastic about affecting positive change. And of course, a strong communicator helps too. So that was my early mistake, not making sure I had that particular physician identified.
Well, we all make mistakes in our career. I think the greater question is how do we learn from it and grow from them? You talked a little bit about physician engagement and the who. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the how then. So how do you effectively partner with physicians to reduce clinical variation? What does that look like?
Well, it's not going to be any surprise, but when it comes to engaging physicians and getting them to change their behavior in clinical redesign efforts. You have to remember physicians are scientists. They're not going to change the way they practice medicine unless you start with hard, comprehensive data. Once they see that, similar to what we talked about before, once you see that, they will change their behaviors. It's that peer-to-peer open conversations that makes behavior changes and makes them sustainable and long-term. So I think it's identifying the need to be aware of unwarranted variation. All stakeholders need to be aware of the problem of unwarranted variation, and we need to be involved in the development of improvement strategies. Keep the physicians involved with that strategy. It only works if the doctors themselves acknowledge the presence of unwarranted variation and they are ready to initiate the change. That could be hospitalists, that could be family practice, that could be internal medicine, it could be orthopedics, but they have to be involved. So engaging physicians and then implementing risk-adjusted analytics are two strategies that hospitals can use to address clinical variation. We utilize system and physician data, which details various metrics such as utilization, cost, length of stay, outcomes, and readmissions. You have to get into a pattern of routinely presenting this data. Physicians who need to improve are intrinsically motivated to do so. And therefore, we need to stay in front of them to adhere to the clinical redesign process that will reduce variation in standardized care.
Are there any questions that you wished I asked in this interview but didn't?
I would say there's an uncomfortable truth about clinical variation. So if I could just go that direction for just a minute.
Sure.
Nick, I think it'll help our audience.
Yeah.
It's the risk of exposure that everyone has fear of. Many providers just are not true advocates of outcome data, and particularly the transparency. It's because they have to change their practices. So many physicians fear looking compared to their peers, and this stalls the transparency, accountability, and change. Additionally, leaders of healthcare systems are challenged with successfully changing this paradigm with their physicians or providers. So the status quo often wins out. It's really a significant issue as providers are the primary drivers of our healthcare spending and quality. Providers or physicians are the entry point into our healthcare systems, which is why healthcare systems must work with the physicians to deliver quality care while controlling costs. As you know, providers direct care. Issues like choosing outpatient treatment versus admissions, ordering diagnostic tests, prescribing the course of treatment, and discharging a patient from the hospital are all driven by the providers. So I think that would be one thing, Nick, that I would have to say. There are still those that just don't want this peer-to-peer exposure.
So that's one of the challenges also in reducing care variation. What are some of the other challenges that you encounter when you're working on reducing variation in practice?
Most hospital systems have difficulty obtaining and maintaining credible data that is not just a one-time, here's our problem, but is actually produced on a daily basis. And changing behavior is difficult. Hardwiring the improvement throughout the organization is challenging. But the reality of it is, Nick, we see that, these unwarranted clinical variations cost our healthcare systems $20 to $30 million a year, whether it's length of stay, overuse of CT scans, boarding issues. So it's not something we can turn away from and not address. Clinical care variation has many drivers, which add to the challenge of changing behavior. Some of the challenges, if you look at some of the hospitals we work with, are payer mix and contracts, the community demographics, inner city hospitals, physicians-induced demand, that executives are hesitant to address the physicians because they're high producers. And then, of course, hospital and practice culture. And then there's the physician specialty mix. Organizations bearing population risk with employed physicians who have strong care base are best equipped to reduce care variation, as the financial interests of the hospitals, physician groups, and specialties are best aligned for success. And when I say that, I'm really talking about hospitals who actually are either for profit or actually own their own insurance companies. Those particular hospitals are poised for success in limiting clinical variation.
Interesting. What are the most common categories of clinical variation reduction initiatives that you see hospitals engaging in or looking for improvement and help in?
So I would say at this time, I don't know many hospitals that aren't actively engaged in clinical variation, but the three areas that they're looking at, clinical practice and physician behavior, are clinical resource utilization, length of stay, and clinical documentation. And I want to step back just for a second, Nick. When I talk about clinical resource utilization, it's a pretty broad area. It can be from everything from outpatient versus inpatient treatment. It can be ordering diagnostic tests. It can be prescribing the course of treatment, or even just discharging the patient from the hospital and planning the discharge way before the day of discharge. Disposition planning. Improvement in any of these areas, Nick, are going to result in significant expense reduction and quality improvement, as well as an improvement in the per month PMPM spend, which drives shared savings opportunity in value-based care. So I keep focusing on value-based care because today is as good as it's going to get. We have to all be prepared, if you're not already in the thrust of value-based care, that clinical variation has to be addressed.
Okay. A lot of our conversation so far has been really on the physician side. And I guess my question is, when it comes to clinical variation, where's a place that our nurse executives should start and focus in on as an opportunity to add value to the organization and to patients in terms of reducing variation?
So I would first focus on your MDRs, your rounds, and making sure that you have scripted rounds that focus on length of stay. For surgical patients, you need to have a plan from before admission as to where they're going to be discharged and when they're going to be discharged. Don't be hesitant to have conversations with the family on day one about the expectations for discharge. That's not just with surgery. Let them know what their choices are for discharge day one. Help narrow that field down. So I think sometimes we're hesitant to talk to patients about discharge time is 11 a.m. Please anticipate that you'll be going to a sniff. Here are your choices, and move it forward, and move it forward very quickly. MDRs need to be attended by not just the hospitalists and residents. Our nurses and our CRC teams need to be actively engaged on all rounds. Round by specialties with your CRCs. Let them use their expertise to expedite the discharge planning. So that's where I would first start at for our nurse leaders. I think that is a pivotal point of care right now in reducing length of stay.
Great, thank you. We've talked a lot about clinical variation. Any closing thoughts or wrap-up thoughts that you may have?
There are so many sources of variation in medicine. Variation, choice of product, length of stay, testing. It represents about 25 to 65% of our medical cost, just variation. Not to be hard about this, but these costs are pure waste. So the variances erode the quality of care and dramatically increase the cost associated with that care. The good news is that I keep referring to it as unwarranted variation because I want to be very clear that not every patient is alike, and some clinical variation may very well be warranted, but we're referring to unwarranted variation. It can be identified and addressed through a combination of processes of optimization, leadership, and strong application of data. Understanding and addressing sources of variation lets your executives and your clinician focus on what is really unique to the patient and their situation. And consequently, Let's our organizations focus on delivering the best possible care to our patients.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Karen. I appreciate it.
Nick, it was a pleasure.
You've been listening to the BRG Nurse Executive Podcast, which focuses on improving patient care by advancing nursing leadership. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and podcast guest and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, position, or policy of the guest employer, Berkeley Research Group, or their other respective employees and affiliates.